Imagine that you're living in New York City in 1912 and you've just heard some horrific news. Last night, the largest ocean liner in history, the Titanic, collided with an iceberg and sank, leading to the deaths of nearly 2,000 people. It's shocking. It shocks you, it shocks your family. Everyone in the whole country is blown away and mourning this tragedy. The newspapers post gruesome witness accounts of children freezing to death in the water, men and women jumping from the elevated rear of the boat to certain deaths. Every sentence you read is terrifying. In a single day, the incident becomes a shared cultural experience of grief in America. 30 days later, there's an advertisement in your newspaper for a new film coming out today. A movie set on the Titanic, the gruesome tale of hundreds of dead men, women, and children. Come and get your ticket. Only a month after the actual Titanic's disaster, how would that movie's release make you feel? Would you feel it was appropriate or disrespectful, a money grab? How do you process that movie? In 1912, that's the question society was faced with. Saved from the Titanic, a film written, directed, edited, and released in the 1-month anniversary of the Titanic sinking, opens nationwide. The film immediately gets shredded by backlash. A notable critic in New York said the film was, quote, truly revolting when the horrors of the event are so very fresh in our mind. The film was so despised that it straight up killed the promising career of Dorothy Gibson, the movie's main actress. She was accused of being a money-loving harlot and never made another big movie again. None of this negative reception may sound unusual to you. I mean, what do they expect? It's actually a huge surprise to the studio behind the film, because society had never dealt with capitalizing on disasters in multimedia entertainment before. Theaters were only getting built about 5 years ago. Unlike books, this new technology of movies brought audiences into tragedies to see firsthand the horrors of what had happened. And all of this led to an important ethical question. Is entertainment based around recent tragedy okay? On September 11th, 2001, it was our generation's turn to face that question. Beginning at 8:46 a.m., 19 religious extremists, organized in part by Osama bin Laden, hijack 4 passenger planes to commit suicide attacks on U.S. targets. One crashes into a field in Pennsylvania, one hits the Pentagon, and the remaining 2 are flown into the north and south towers of the New York World Trade Center. 40 minutes after initial impacts, the 2 towers fall. In total, nearly 3,000 people lost their lives in about an hour. Not unlike the people of 1912, we were experiencing a shared cultural moment of grief around a tragedy, but this time, the first use of that tragedy wouldn't be a movie. It would be a game. And that game would come out 12 hours later. Hi, I'm Paper Will. Join me as we analyze the history and tricky ethics of interactive media designed around 9/11. Our goal is not to condone or glorify these games. It's not even really to condemn them. No, our goal is to understand them and why they exist. Let's get started. Keep in mind that casual gaming was in a very different place in 2001 compared to now. It's impossible to overstate how huge Adobe Flash games were, and Newgrounds.com was the most popular place to play them. Founded in 1995 by 17-year-old Tom Fulp, it was essentially the app store of the early internet. And on the night of 9/11, at 9:57 p.m., a Newgrounds.com user by the name of Character Killer uploaded the first 9/11 game. It was titled Grandfather Killed. It was a hyper-simple, semi-interactive animation showing a plane hitting one of the towers, followed by red text reading that the game maker's grandfather, Bill Willett, had fallen from the World Trade Center observation deck. Initial comments were pretty supportive, but in the weeks to come, there was some criticism of the game's author, as no one by the name of Bill Willett actually died on 9/11. Considering how soon it was after the towers fell when this game was uploaded and all the phone service outages that day, it's possible the man named Bill Willett actually survived and Character Killer just didn't know about that yet. It's also possible he just made the name up to get some upvotes. We don't know. Regardless of the backstory, the fact remains this was technically the world's first 9/11 game. Less than 60 seconds later at 9:58 p.m., still on September 11th, the second 9/11 game appears. The only solution let you press a button and drop an American bomb on a simple two-tone background representing the Middle East. It hits a poorly drawn brown stick figure who melts into a cartoonish puddle of blood. The ending screen finishes with a call to arms, a lesson these animals will never forget. This sentiment, while awful and horrible, was not uncommon so soon after the attacks. In the upcoming days and weeks, there would be a high tide of lashing out against anyone who was perceived as Middle Eastern. According to the FBI, hate crimes against Muslims increased from 29 incidents between January 1st and September 11th to over 460 incidents by December of that year. Thousands of people were harassed or assaulted simply for vaguely looking like the men responsible for the 9/11 attacks. It's worth remembering that many people consider the immediate post-9/11 period to be a point of unity among Americans, and there is some truth to that, but we should also keep in mind that those feelings of brotherhood didn't quite extend to all Americans, and we'll see that reflected in many of these next few games. Steve C., the author of The Only Solution, submitted several sequels in the next few hours, each a bit more not safe for work than the last. I can't even show you his most popular game because it was literally a game where you went around and shot Middle Eastern children who were making the peace sign. Yeah, things got dark. And remember, this is all still on September 11th. Several non-interactive animations appeared in the next few hours, but the next true game didn't get uploaded until September 12th. Hosted on Angelfile Arcade was Trade Center Defender, submitted by users Steph and Phil. The player had to shoot down hijacked passenger planes that were headed towards the World Trade Center. If a plane got through, it would hit the tower and the building would collapse. This is probably the first 9/11 media of any kind to receive negative pushback, and that huge response led Steve and Phil to taking it down the next day. The game was so controversial that it even had an article published on BBC about it. When I started researching for this part of the video, I had assumed that most of that pushback for the game was about shooting down passenger planes that would have been full of civilians. I figured that even if some people recognized that as a necessary evil, it was still a bit unpalatable 24 hours after the attacks. But I was a little off. The majority of comments had a much bigger problem, not with the content, but just that a 9/11 game existed. Grandfather Killed and The Only Solution games, well, they flew under people's notice, as I think most people were just too busy with, 9/11. But Trade Center Defender snagged a lot of attention. A couple of years later, one of the creators did an interview and said that he was disappointed that people didn't understand the game and the message. According to him, if you played Trade Center Defender long enough, you would realize that there was no win condition. You just continued shooting until you missed a plane and the towers go down. The point was that there's no way to win against terrorism with violence, because it doesn't matter how many planes you shoot. There are always going to be more planes. If he's telling the truth about his intentions with this game, well, it's a layer of complexity that wasn't very common in early 9/11 content. We also saw a slightly more ham-fisted message from the game designer Atrio on September 13th with the release of the game Turban Hunt, which parodied the Nintendo Entertainment System's Duck Hunt game. It even used the original music from that game, but instead of shooting birds, you just shoot bin Laden's head a bunch. After enough shots, the game would chastise you for using violence, saying, "You are now officially no better than him." It was a less graceful attempt at social commentary, but it was an attempt. This 2001 period for 9/11 games was a wild west of experimentation, where creators were still trying to figure out which kind of content would get their stuff noticed without it also getting destroyed by backlash. For example, an early popular game was Whack Osama. Submitted by user Antishow, it was a whack-a-mole game where you hit Osama bin Laden. Even Tom Fulp, the previously mentioned founder of Newgrounds, well, he got into the ring and released his own game. Titled Bad Dudes vs. Bin Laden, you play as a stereotypical badass Rambo character who fights Osama bin Laden with nut punches and shin kicks. And credit to him, his game had a strong emphasis on not taking your anger out on people based on their ethnicity or skin color. The opening said, "We've got no problem with our Arab buddies, except for one, Osama bin Laden." The game description also read, "I tried to pack the game with a positive message. There are a lot of nice people in my city who wear turbans, and I don't want other people giving them dirty looks just because of some wacko terrorist." Fulp was giving people an emotional release while also pushing them not to buy into xenophobic blind revenge. And there's some science that supports this as an effective persuasive tool. In Ion Bogost, The Expressive Power of Video Games, he says that not only can video games support existing social and cultural positions, but they can also disrupt and change positions before they solidify, leading to potentially significant long-term social change. On September 12th, opinions were still being formed about how we should react to the previous day's attack, and Fulp was cleverly using games to try and curb reactions away from the hate he knew might be coming. Unfortunately, it's possible his strategy had the reverse effect. Soon after Bad Dudes vs. Bin Laden was released, a new kind of game would soon become the predominant form of interactive 9/11 media. Games where you hurt Bin Laden a lot. This genre was known as torture simulators, and in these games, the player was given a variety of tools and weapons to hurt a character on screen. Often, the character on screen was Osama bin Laden, so you might be thinking, well, isn't that exactly what Fulp wanted? Focused anger on the person responsible, not just anyone of Middle Eastern descent, but a decent chunk of these games, especially early on, simply used an unnamed Middle Eastern man that doesn't even look like Osama bin Laden. Either way, the games like this struck a chord with the Flash game audience, and a tsunami of similar interactive media appeared soon after. There was Torture Osama, Osama Bloody BL, Osama bin Haydn, Osama Whack 1.6, Deep Fry Osama, Blow Osama to Hell, Osama Hunter, Raid Osama. The list goes on and on. There are hundreds more games just like these. I ended up playing more than about 75 of these torture sims, and after a while I started having this gnawing sense of discomfort. Let's be clear, there's a huge difference between a mass murder game like The Only Solution sequels and a game where you beat up a mass murderer. One is psychotic and the other is cartoonish revenge porn against a known terrorist. They're not even comparable, but in 2001, Newgrounds' audience was overwhelmingly underage, and the idea of kids playing torture games, even if the person being tortured is a huge douchebag, it's an uncomfortable thought to me. As we moved into 2002, we get into what you might call the peak age of 9/11 games. It sounds really odd to phrase it like that, but it's true. Between 2002 and 2004, there was a huge improvement in the quality of the genre. Moving away from hastily thrown together torture games of 2001, these submissions were more complex, better made, and had way more polish. For example, UN Weapons Inspector was a pretty good Minesweeper clone with fully voiced animated cutscenes. There was also an increasing number of military shooters that were adapting console or PC mechanics into these games, such as 2003's War on Terrorism. This was a fully developed flash shooter with multiple weapons in 4 different missions. It had good-looking level design and an increasingly brutal but fair difficulty curve. This was a legitimately good game. Also, the terrorist bunker had a poster for Mamma Mia, the Broadway show. I don't know what that's about. But by 2006, the number of reactionary 9/11 games being made had begun to drop. There are a lot of reasons, but part of that is probably due to the increasingly mixed feelings the US had about their military involvement in Afghanistan and Iraq. Between 2003 and 2006, the US occupation of Iraq went from 60% approval to nearly 60% disapproval. There was a significant loss in confidence about how we were reacting to 9/11, and that reflected in the games about it. By 2010, the 9/11 game genre was basically on its deathbed. People had lost interest, and flash game popularity was vanishing anyway. Smartphone app libraries were becoming the new standard way to play casual games, and those libraries were tightly curated. Very few games dealing with a heavy topic like 9/11 were getting approved. But before you write off the genre entirely, in November of 2010, it gave us a couple of death rattles in the form of 2 final games. The first game was titled 9/11 Simulator. Unlike the majority of early 9/11 content, this game actually put you in the role of the terrorist. You flew a jumbo jet through New York City, avoiding missiles to hit your target. The game received some backlash, but not that much, and nothing even remotely comparable to what Trade Center Defender got. The second game, and the worst thing on this entire list, was 9/11 Jumpers, where you controlled somebody jumping off the World Trade Center to avoid burning to death. I don't know what to say about this game. Like, my only advice about this is don't watch a bunch of actual 9/11 footage like I did to prepare for this video, and then play games like 9/11 Jumpers. It is not a fun combination. And for a while, that was it. The supply and demand had simply run out of 9/11 games as entertainment, but in 2015, we got something new. It was a first-person virtual reality empathy simulator titled 846. You play an office worker on the 101st floor of the North Tower on the morning of 9/11. Starting on a normal day of work, things take a horrible turn as you witness the impact of a plane below you, see the spreading fire, listen to coworkers making phone calls to loved ones saying goodbye, and watching helplessly as others are jumping out of windows to avoid flames. As your vision blurs from the smoke, you feel the finality of your situation. You're given a choice: burn to death or jump. This simulator took a massive beating from gaming journalists and newspapers and players for being in poor taste, being disturbing, inappropriate, insufficiently respectful, unnecessary, you name it, this game was accused of it. And those people were right that 846 is disturbing and troubling, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. There's increasing evidence that these kinds of VR empathy simulators could be powerful educational and social tools. In 2018, a researcher from the Wales Institute for Cognitive Neuroscience co-published a project where a group of male domestic violence offenders experienced a virtual reality scene of abuse, but from the perspective of the person being abused. The post-study results showed an increased degree of empathy for victims of domestic abuse. In 2019, social artist Nona de la Peña's Hunger in Los Angeles showed participants the plight of modern homelessness, raising awareness and money for the issue. In 2020, Project Syria had empathy events that put you in the shoes of starving Syrian refugees. These virtual projects, while often distressing, humanize individuals who would otherwise just be statistics to us. While you or I may not have any trouble empathizing with people in the World Trade Center on 9/11, it might not be so easy for someone born 10, 50, or 100 years in the future. Apps like 846 might help that person remember why this was such a tragic event in US history, and wasn't that the promise we made to ourselves that day? That we'd never forget? I started this video telling you about Saved from the Titanic, released only a month after the ship sank, a movie that ended Dorothy Gibson's career, but I left something important out of that story. See, Dorothy Gibson was on the Titanic, the actual Titanic. She was lucky enough to get out on the last lifeboat, and as soon as she arrived home, she and her movie producer boyfriend started working on recording everything she had witnessed from that night. Gibson's notes became the script for Saved from the Titanic. In later interviews, she claimed that the nation and the world had been profoundly grieved by the sinking of the Titanic, and I had the unique opportunity to pay tribute to those who died on that awful night. That's all I ever tried to do. But people saw her project as exploitation of that tragedy. It's easy to look at games about 9/11 in the same way, and many, maybe most of them, were exploitation, but who's to say if a few weren't like Saved from the Titanic? Some game creators' desperate attempt to express the grief of something they or someone they loved experienced. Almost all the games mentioned today can be found down in the description if you're interested in seeing more. A few of them have been taken down by their original creators, but the majority are still up, although I don't really recommend playing any of these. Anyway, thank you for watching this video. I hope you think I treated the subject matter with the appropriate amount of respect. That was super important to me while working on this project. And if you like this kind of content, feel free to subscribe. Either way, have a chill week, and maybe I'll see you soon.